Well, I'm learning this the hard way because I just recorded this video and clicked the wrong button and didn't save it. So I'm going to keep it short and sweet. We're talking today about the beginning of chapter 9, or effects of the revolution, and I'm going to divide this into social, political, and economic results. I'm going to start with political. First of all, let's look at the name of the country. It is the United States. Each of those 13 colonies, once we declare independence, is functioning as an individual country. Okay? Because the word state is often synonymous with the word country. So each of these states is independent, but they're agreeing to work together, especially early in our history, because they're still trying to win the revolution. So they've declared themselves independent. Now they have to win their independence. Several features, because the states have to write their own constitutions once we do declare independence, they are going to have some common features. First of all, they're going to be Republican in nature. They're going to represent the people. How much power should be given to the people is really kind of a question that we deal with off and on throughout our history. But some of those features include the fact that we write a constitution at all is one of the features, because we are not subject to whatever the legislature decides to pass today. They are bound by limits within that state constitution. The power or the authority to government or the authority to govern comes from the people and with the consent of the people. So the idea of popular sovereignty or people's rule is one of the features. The second feature is the idea of limited government. The government must operate within the law. They are not above the law. And that law is written in that constitution. And if a change is needed, then it takes both parties to be able to change it. It takes the government and the people's agreement to make that change. Thirdly, is they had some sort of Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights, but this was a list of things government couldn't do. And keeping in mind, of course, that these people have lived through the war and before that, the colonial period, when, for example, the government didn't need a search warrant. They could just search whenever they wanted. So that's going to be something they want to limit government's ability to do. Lastly, the idea of separation of powers. Governmental power is divided into three distinct and separate, yet important equal branches. Legislative branch makes laws, executive branch carries them out or enforces them, and lastly, the judicial branch is there to resolve disputes or interpret laws if necessary. None of these can function on their own. They all have to function together, and so that give and take and that incredibly slow process of governing is intentional. Because we don't want Congress to be able to go in today and say, we need to do this, pass the law, and it goes into effect automatically. That process is part of what makes government work, even though it can be increasingly and very frustrating at times. Next, let's talk about social effects. One of the big things is the idea of equality. Keep in mind that the loyalists, or people who remain loyal to Great Britain during the war, many of them are going to go back to Great Britain. So that more conservative part of the population is going to be gone. So the people that are left are going to be those patriots, or those people that lean toward leaned toward the idea of independence, and this idea of all men are created equal, a very controversial, talked about phrase in the Declaration of Independence that we are still trying to define. But some movements toward equality are the idea of ending property inheritance laws. You can leave your property to who you want. It doesn't have to go to your eldest son. Many northern states are going to abolish slavery. We're going to have our first anti-slavery society. Let's talk about this idea of abolishing slavery. Even though slavery did not exist past this early independent phase in the northern states, there certainly was no provision for equality or treatment of African Americans. They were still legally discriminated against for many years in past the Civil War. One of the big ones socially is the separation of church and state. We take that for granted, and we often forget that prior to the war, and even after the war, we had tax money in Virginia supporting the Anglican Church in Virginia, or tax money in Massachusetts supporting the Congregationalist Church in Massachusetts. So the idea of separating that out was a relatively new one. Thomas Jefferson writes the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It is passed, it is adopted, but he receives an enormous amount of criticism for it, especially when he runs for president later. Nasty political campaigns are not unique to modern day. They go as far back as we've had political campaigns. Lastly, now for social trends is the idea of Republican motherhood. What role do women have in this new country? We haven't talked a lot about them, but we know that obviously they're an important part of populating and keeping the day-to-day functions of society running. And with this new emphasis on republicanism and that we need good, virtuous citizens, that requires a good, virtuous upbringing. And so mothers are charged with the idea of producing good citizens, okay? And that mothers are the moral conscience of the country. And we look to them to keep us on the right track, so to speak. So even though women's roles are still going to be very traditional roles, they are recognized as an important part of what makes society work. Lastly, economic results. And these are kind of immediate effects. We'll be talking more about economy throughout the year. But all of those loyalists that returned to Great Britain, that land that they had previously owned was divided and sold. And one of the unique features about the American Revolution and the War for Independence is that we avoid a lot of the excess that is typically associated with a revolution, such as happened in France and later Russia. And the big reason for this is because we have plenty of land available. When your land resources are very restricted, there's always going to be a lot of conflict over obtaining that land. We don't have that issue in the United States. You can just keep moving west. And so a lot of conflict is avoided because we can just basically leave our problems behind and move west. Keep in mind, too, and your book does a good job of explaining this, the idea that before a group of people can obtain political democracy or participation in the political process, they're going to have to reach some sort of degree of economic access. So we're going to have people who have access to our resources, land, wealth, those things before we see them being allowed to participate in the political process. We had a huge increase in manufacturing because think about it, for 10 years or more, we have been boycotting British items in response to various attempts by the British to increase their tax revenues. So we have started manufacturing many things for ourselves. Next, we've had trade decrease because so much of our trade was with Great Britain under the mercantilism, but now we're free to trade with other countries. So all of that smuggling that took place is no longer smuggling, it's just legal trade. And it's not going to take Britain very long to get over the revolution and resume trading with the United States. We have too many resources for them to ignore us. And part of the reason for our win and British lost is the British public just kind of lost interest in fighting the revolution. Okay, the light went out. I know it's time to wrap up. Inflation, last economic result we're going to talk about. The colonies and then the United States issued paper money to try to deal with the economic conditions of fighting the war. It's not going to be very effective because it's going to be pretty worthless by the time the war's over. And those economic problems are going to continue to build and be one of the reasons that we end up finally with a constitution. Tomorrow night we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation, our first form of government. Don't forget to bring your book tomorrow for test corrections, and I'll see you then. Bye.